Right, so I'm very pleased to be welcoming our three practice directors to join me in a panel discussion on the topic of integrated risk management. This was billed earlier on this morning by Simon as a battle between the three of them, so hopefully we can keep it clean. They've got a bit of social distancing between them, which will help, I'm sure. So I think that before we start, I thought it might be useful just to summarise the way that we describe integrated risk management, or what integrated risk management means for Turnkey. And it actually hopefully explains why we feel that it's important to bring together all of our practice directors, because all of the things we do as an organisation are about managing risk. And it's important to think about integrating the management of risk as well, and looking at all of the elements of control that you're operating in the organisation to help you manage that risk. So interestingly, a couple of years ago, Gartner redefined GRC as being integrated risk management. And when they did that, we started to think, well, what does that new term mean? Does it mean anything different for us? And I think what was interesting actually is that Gartner's definition of integrated risk management tends to focus on bringing together silos of risk to be managed in an integrated way, and to manage risk across the organisation in an integrated way. And it's very much a horizontal approach to the management of risk. The way that we look at things from Turnkey's perspective is, whilst that's really important, and it is a key part of how we think of managing risk in an integrated way, it's also important to think about integrated risk management from a vertical perspective as well. Thinking about surfacing as much fact as you can from the way that you operate your controls in your organisation and how you respond to risk into the risk management process from an enterprise perspective, so that you're actually able to not only bring together the ways that you're managing risk from a risk silo perspective horizontally across the organisation, but also from a vertical perspective, you're bringing as much fact into that risk management process as possible, and you're not leaving the responses to risk purely down to how people are describing their responses to risk, and that self-assessment process, which we all know has its own fallibilities around whether people are genuinely operating all of the risks, the controls that they might describe they're operating. So I think it's important to think of integrated risk management as being both a horizontal thing and also a vertical thing. I'm really pleased to introduce our practice directors. So I'd like to hand over just to let them introduce themselves. So I think Mark introduced himself at the beginning of the day, but I'll hand over to you first, Mark, since this is your practice area.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name's Mark Jackson, and I lead Turnkey's integrated risk management practice in the UK. So I guess the tagline for our practice is to help manage business risk more effectively. So we help organizations to identify and define those risks that are significant to them, enable them to inform and then manage those risks through various data, so KPIs, control activities, other risk relevant data across their enterprise. So that sort of speaks to that vertical siloing that you were talking about earlier, Richard, and also allow them to aggregate and report this data up so you can understand the impacts to your business objectives, and at the end of the day, help you to make smarter, more risk-informed business decisions.
Thanks, Mark. Chris, do you want to go next?
Yeah, cheers, Richard. So hi, everyone. So I'm Chris Boyle. I'm the Practice Director for Identity and Access Management at Turnkey. I've been in the identity space for probably around 20 years, and our practice is really set up to, well, in keeping with Mark's tagline, process. We like to help people give the right access to the right people at the right time for the right reasons. And we help people implement the controls around identity and how they access the systems, how they report on the systems. That are all essentially the risk element.
Thanks, Chris. And Tom?
Thanks, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm Tom Venables. I'm the director of our application and cybersecurity practice, which means a lot of the controls that we're discussing here and the addressing of risk within the application layer, both for internal threats and external threats, flows through me with guidance from Mark's IRM practice to give us some weighting, some understanding of what risk we're addressing, and interfacing quite closely with Chris to make sure that the identities he provides are on the applications that people need.
Thanks, Tom. So to kick us off, I just wanted to pose a question. In terms of when I kind of think of integrated risk management, one of the key sort of success criteria is about linking risk management activities to the detailed security and control responses to those risks. So what are some of the main challenges that you've seen in that regard in terms of that integration and in terms of linking those controls to risk?
So I'll kick off here then, Richard, with that one. So yeah, I think this is again speaking to that vertical that you were talking about earlier. We certainly did the horizontal aspects. Breaking up those risk silos is really important, and that's something that we want to try and achieve and unlock for our clients, so that they can manage risk in a much more consistent way across their enterprise, regardless of the type of risk it is that they're managing. Because quite often there's those interrelationships between them anyway. But certainly connecting risk with controls is also crucial to kind of the way that we approach integrated risk management in order to help inform your risk levels from a residual risk perspective. It's all very well assigning controls as risk responses and being comfortable with the fact that you've got the right responses in place, but knowing how those responses are operating. Are they effectively managing the risk that they're there to mitigate, and what is that actually doing to the residual risk levels is something that's really important to know. So some of the challenges around achieving that, though, sometimes it is around enabling some platforms, usually some digital platforms across both your risks and your controls. Some organizations have digital platforms for the controls, some for their risks, not always for both, and that can sometimes make it a bit of a challenge to be able to manage that data in various different formats, some of it manually, some of it more automated. So having a kind of a consistent platform across which you can manage both of those aspects is one of the challenging things. And even when you do have those platforms that enable you to do some of those more sophisticated things by linking up the risk with the controls, achieving that integration sometimes is also a challenge as well between those different solutions, because it might not be one enterprise solution that you've got in place. It might be two or more different solutions which are catering for specific areas around your risk and control. So in order for those different solutions to speak to each other, you need to have some integration solutions in place. So that can also is something that we found that can be quite a challenge for clients. The other thing is also being able to kind of achieve greater depth and reach into your risk relevant data across your enterprise. So depending on the type of solution that you've got in place, sometimes it's restricted to be able to obtain information or risk relevant data that up to a certain point, data that sits in a certain enterprise system, for example, whereas other platforms enable you to reach that a little bit further, obtain data which is still very useful, but it sits in those dark corners of the enterprise, which otherwise you're not able to obtain very easily. But sometimes that's where some of the most rich data, around KRIs or KPIs, or key control indicators as well, that's where some of the rich data reside. So it's important that you're able to tap into that data regardless of where it sits in the enterprise. So again, those are all this sort of interconnectivity, that integration, being able to reach into those far corners where the data sits within your enterprise. That's definitely a challenge, and something that we look to try and help our clients with.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Mark. I think you picked up on one of the key points there. There's a lot of tooling that is addressing risk out there, but it's not necessarily driven from a risk management discussion. I might have a conversation with a CISO about a SIEM solution, which helps to inform what residual risk you've got around your security incidents that are happening across your estate. But we're not necessarily integrating that with your part of the business to say, okay, what's that doing to our residual risk score? Likewise, Chris and I might talk to an operations manager or an ITSM function about identity and access management that they're investing in for operational effectiveness, without understanding what that's doing to their access risks. So pulling all of that together, I think, is key.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing from an identity perspective is the key things that we always try to understand is, what are the main risks, that we're helping to mitigate against this. Ultimately, with identity access management, it's all about controlling the access to key things, but to avoid and mitigate against those risks. So, ultimately, without the risks, there would be no IAM, because everyone would have access to everything. So it's really important to understand, prioritize those risks, and that's where it joined up between risk management and IAM.
Cool. So the next kind of question I had for you guys was just around audit, really. The sort of more modern approach to audit, or say modern, it's at least 20 years old now, because it was the approach when I started auditing it back at PwC. But around risk is taking a risk-based approach to audit. So I just wondered, with regards, just thinking about audit, what are some of the main challenges you've had or you've seen clients have with regards to their risk management activities on their audit findings?
Well, I think sometimes, if you're not looking at things with a risk lens and a risk focus, then it's difficult to identify what your key controls are, because your key controls should be hanging off those significant risks, those risks with the high scoring based on the impact and probability. So the risks will inform where those key controls sit within your organization, so you can put the majority of your efforts and your focus on ensuring that those controls are operating effectively. Sometimes IT controls maybe aren't seen as being as obvious in that space. I talked about this earlier in my session around the UK SOX regulation that's kind of forthcoming over the next couple of years or so. And even though that regulation is focused around financial reporting and the risks around that, IT controls are going to be a fundamental part of it, because at the end of the day, they're there to support these IT systems house the data which feeds into your accounts and ends up on your financial statements. So IT controls around those systems are absolutely foundational to secure the completeness, accuracy, validity, restricting people to accessing certain data as well. And actually, we talk about common audit issues that crop up time and time again. It's the IT controls which are things that people struggle with, which to my mind sometimes can be some of the more simple things which you can deal with. There are a lot more, particularly some of the key controls, if you think about an SAP environment and some of the underlying core IT controls around or the IT general controls around making sure that you're following a certain good change management principles by locking up certain systems within your landscape. These are all driven by very simple kind of binary configurable controls. It should be quite easy things to monitor, but quite often these are time and time again, these are things that get flagged up by their external auditors, and they get sort of dragged across the coals as a result of it. So there's some very easy sort of quick wins that they can achieve when it comes to that. Other areas, and again, this is all needs to be driven and advised and prioritized through the risk management side of things, is again on the key controls, the documentation and the evidence. That's going to be a real key thing when it comes to the introduction of UK SOX. I mentioned the sort of the SOX motto: if you can't prove it, it didn't happen, and that's very much going to be the case. Anybody with US SOX sort of experience and background will tell you that you may be doing all the right things all of the time, but if you can't prove that you're doing all the right things all the time, it doesn't count for anything, and it'll end up with an audit issue as a result of that. So yeah, ultimately risks are there to advise you and guide you in the right direction in terms of what things you'll be focusing on, where's the biggest impact to us, and therefore what things do we need to protect the most.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from an ITGC perspective as well, and things happening from sort of time and time again. Like it's been for around sort of 20 years, the same sort of frameworks. And, we're seeing, we still see problems with the JML process. We still see one of the most common things in IAM that we pick up is around the movers and the levers and what people do with them. So as people still collecting access as they move around the organisation, and accounts not being disabled and things. It's just these kind of simple concepts. In IAM, we're in a world now where it's artificial intelligence and machine learning, and there's all these these really kind of high level technologies to help drive efficiencies within the business. But ultimately, we still see organisations having audit points raised, because they haven't disabled levers within a certain time frame and things like that. So they're trying to achieve the things like role-based access control and attribute-based access control and all the different new methods and ways of dealing with access. But ultimately, the most common things are still the basics. So it's, again, when you think about automating processes, if the processes aren't correct or they're not efficient, then you're just going to make things happen. Make the bad things happen a lot quicker. So, and much more recently, and I think this aligns with with Tom's practice as well, is that we're seeing a lot in the privileged access space. So, with all of the ransomware outbreaks that are happening, across the world, and now it's kind of mainstream news type work, and people are really focusing around how they deal with privileged access and across their estate. And as well, Tom, and with the business that you see that PAM's really a priority for people.
Absolutely. I think from my side, privileged access is one of the most effective ways to jump laterally across systems that we're seeing from penetration attacks. It's been on audit reports for at least the last 20 years, as Richard pointed out. But I think the speed of change is one of the key challenges. The audit findings don't really change, but the number of systems that they apply to and the adoption of those systems and the speed of development is making that a real challenge. And we're starting to see a much more focus on DevSecOps, open source adoption, API security, those kind of things. That now you've got to apply all of those controls and checks to make sure that not only do you stay compliant, but you're effectively managing the risks there.
Yeah, and obviously those risks are evolving on a constant basis, aren't they? So the kind of scope that you're going to be audited against evolves. I mean, I think cybersecurity is kind of a topic that's gradually finding its way onto the audit scope more and more, isn't it? So.
Yeah, and the common refrain there is that the defenders are always on the back foot. We're often in a reactive mode as the maturity of the attacks increases.
Yeah.
Today it's interesting. I was watching a webinar just kind of before this on some of the major attacks that everyone's kind of heard about. The SolarWinds attack and the Bank of Bangladesh that had the largest amount of money ever stolen from it. And of all the sophisticated infrastructure they had in place, it was simply because they didn't fix the basics. Going back to what Mark said, if you don't fix the basics, it doesn't matter what technology you have in place. It's still the thing to prioritize, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, getting that baseline right sounds a lot easier than it seems to be in some organisations, isn't it? So,
yeah.
Mark, you mentioned operational effectiveness. Obviously, it's a term we sort of pretty familiar with, but I mean, it's perhaps you could perhaps just define that and how is an IRM strategy going to contribute towards continuous improvement in that area?
Yeah, sure. So operational effectiveness or control operating effectiveness is effectively controls working as intended, working as per the control description, the control activity, the key elements of that control are being followed, to the letter effectively. Although control operating effectiveness is also worthless so without design effectiveness as well. You could have a control working just as documented, but if that control isn't designed in a way that it's actually managing or meeting the objective, the control objective, which is there, it's intended to meet, which as a result will then mitigate the risk, the operating effectiveness is a bit worthless. So it needs to be designed appropriately first of all, so that it meets the control objective, and then yes, certainly it has to operate effectively as well in order for it to achieve the outcome, which is, you know, managing the risk level down to your sort of target risk scoring. In terms of an IAM strategy, yeah, that's kind of about managing risks efficiently, effectively, being able to kind of, as we talked about earlier, that vertical, connecting those dots between the risks and controls, so that your risks don't end up being kind of standalone master data. They continually get evolved and updated based on the data that feeds into them. You know, your control related data, your KRIs and things like that. So they help to inform each other and as a result give you more meaningful information. So by doing that, kind of it will help you to identify where there are problems. So, you know, if your residual risk scoring isn't hitting your target, you know that there's a problem with one or more of the underlying controls. You can then focus in on those, understand what the issues are, address them, and that in turn will help make your risk scoring a lot more towards the targets that you're aiming for. So they help to kind of inform each other, and yeah, by addressing those problems, that will become more sort of visible as a result in your overall risk universe. So certainly, I think that's a way in which your IAM strategy can help to drive that continuous improvement.
Cool. Thinking about I mean, a lot of our clients are struggling with with elements of their risk management processes, particularly kind of, you know, not necessarily having access to the right technologies and operating things on spreadsheets and stuff. How do you feel that they can build a business case for that kind of investment? What are the kind of key business drivers for those types of investments, and how do they position those with their stakeholders?
So operational resilience has obviously been a big thing talked about over the last year or so, you know, due to the pandemic that we still find ourselves in, and the fact that that's impacted operational resilience for a lot of organizations. You know, it's something that, again, in my session earlier, I talked about Accountancy Europe talking about a couple of areas in which they see will help provide that trust back to the public, and that's if we address some of the challenges around sort of going concern and fraud. So operational resiliency is all linked to that as well. So you need to have, you know, early warning systems in place to be able to inform you when things aren't going early on, things aren't going quite as planned, and you can address them without finding out too late, and it has a catastrophic impact on the organization. You haven't got time to react properly and rebalance. So having that kind of operational resiliency is I think a key business driver for lots of organizations to give them that business case for improving those risk management processes. Also, the fact that you guys touched upon this earlier about the widening threat landscape as well. There's a lot more that we don't know about these days when it comes to risks, because of the greater sophistication when it comes to cybersecurity attacks and the like. Whereas before we kind of knew where things would be coming from, now it's a case of we're kind of finding out as we go along, and things are changing all the time. So we're trying to stay, you know, one step ahead of those, but it's difficult. So the threat that's posed by that and the widening threat landscape is also certainly for me another business driver to give organizations that business case as well. You know, cybersecurity is a big thing on agenda on the board level at the moment, so that should certainly be something that can act as a valid business driver for improving your risk management.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Mark. Just because it's on the board's level, though, until the bill comes is often the proviso there. But I actually see the integrated approach to risk management as being the business driver. So there's an awful lot that you need to do around, you know, hardening your network perimeter, taking a zero-day or zero trust approach to what happens when we get penetrated. And those have been more difficult discussions in the past. They're definitely getting more attention now. But I think if you can tie that back to a quantifiable business risk, where you say the risk of a cyber attack on this critical system for this business process is X amount of pounds, you know, if a manufacturing line goes down or something like that, that really helps CISOs and IT risk organizations to put it into a business context that secures that investment and that drive from the business to secure themselves.
Yeah, agreed. It becomes a lot more meaningful, doesn't it? Because you're putting it in their language that they speak.
Yeah.
And they can see the very real monetary costs as a result of not getting this right. Also, you know, by as you mentioned, the integrated risk management approach, if you can then tie these things back and understand what the impact is on the higher level strategic objectives and how that was going to impact the business from that perspective, and being able to achieve those things, then that, again, that's powerful stuff that you can communicate to the board.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say the same actually, Mark, like kind of linking back to those higher level business objectives and sort of unpacking those to determine the risks of not achieving them, and using that as a starting point for your risk management activities is kind of a key way to enable you to communicate back something that's going to be more meaningful at the board level, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Not to mention that risk management done particularly well doesn't hinder business operations, and a lot of the time it can actually enhance them. So you know, Chris's area is probably one of the easiest to demonstrate that return on investment, where you can achieve real risk reduction, but also operational efficiencies throughout the business, and you know, have positive end user experiences out of the back of it as well. So it doesn't need to be a cost.
Yeah,
Sorry, I was just going to say there's also, you know, with everything being in the mainstream media, there's also the risk of the CISO having to appear on the on the news if anything bad happens. So that's always one that helps you.
All the accountability and none of the funding, mate.
It absolutely, though, you're right. It absolutely should be seen as an enabler rather than a blocker, because you could end up doing so much stuff which is superfluous to what your needs are if you're not managing, if you're not focusing on the risks. You know, we see a lot of clients that have got internal control frameworks that are excessive. You know, I can understand exactly why they're doing it, because they want there's that fear of not managing risks, but truly knowing what your important risks are to your business, having some level of sophistication in scoring them so you can prioritize accordingly, and then being able to address them with the relevant controls is a much more better way, more efficient way of going about doing it than going from the bottom up and throwing as many controls as you can at the risk landscape and hoping that, you know, that helps the noise to go away.
Yeah, and I think a really important point, just sort of going back to what we were talking about earlier around the vertical element of risk management. So, you know, the management element there from a risk management perspective inherently means that you don't stop at a self-assessment. It's also what are your responses to those risks, which then become controls. And then it's about how can you most effectively operate those controls? How can you operate those controls in the most efficient manner? Mm-hmm. And that kind of comes back to the whole control automation piece, whether it's a join and move a lever process, whether it's the automation of assessment of some of your key controls from an IT perspective or whatever. But, you know, there's a lot of things you can do with the technologies that we've talked about today that we help clients to implement to actually make those responses to risk far more efficient, far more effective, and free up time to actually kind of, you know, consume that information from a risk management perspective and do something with it, as opposed to just constantly measuring things and evaluate, you know, constantly doing the actual task. You're actually able to step back and interpret it because you've got the time within your risk management function to do that. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those automation elements and benefits that you rightly talk about aren't just around the control execution. That's certainly a really important part, but it's also around there's a lot of time spent just managing your controls, whether it be trying to gather the right data to report up to the right levels for certain different purposes, and, you know, trying to gather all that information from several different spreadsheets is a far harder task than being able to have that kind of information at your fingertips, and knowing that it's real time and it's not going to be redundant data as soon as you publish that report. So yeah, there's so many, just having that ability to workflow information between people, managing control related issues and having that remediation process all tied up in the same platform, and being able to engage the right people in that as well. These are all what I would call forms of automation. Yes, that's not sitting back and letting the technology do everything for you, but it just brings the right people together in collaboration a lot more effectively, and ensuring that you're all working on the right data, because it's that one version of the truth kind of thing as well.
Yeah. So just one final question, perhaps back to you, Mark, kind of tying together your earlier session with a wrap up on this one. We've obviously got the new legislation coming along that we're starting to see more information around. We keep calling it UK SOX, but I very much doubt they're going to call it SOX. But so we're kind of, information's emerging about that. I guess the question I had for you was what role do you see risk management playing in sort of achieving compliance to that?
Well, there's going to be some, if you think about traditional risk management process, there's going to be some specific processes from that risk practitioners would typically do that will need to be performed as part of a UK SOX regulation, whatever format that takes. Particularly when you think about, so I had a slide in my previous session about showing you the typical annual assessment cycle for such a regulation, and part of that is at the start of the year having to do a big scoping exercise. So that identifies what entities are critical to you, therefore what controls which are operating there need to be in scope for testing, and also the level of testing that needs to be performed based off some materiality analysis, and all that involves risk assessments as well. So risk assessments are going to be key as part of those scoping exercises. But there's also the general use of the IAM platform, whatever platform you are using, again to achieve that kind of vertical integration between risks and controls, connecting those lower level risks, rolling them up to, or connecting them with the high level strategic ones, allowing you to perform that level of aggregation between risks where there are those connections, and understanding of what the impact is on the strategic objective. So yeah, no different really to how you should be viewing integrated risk management right now, but it's obviously going to be done with a gusto, with a very real sort of purpose behind it, based on complying with the regulation.
Cool, thank you. So just sort of to wrap up, we've got a few questions from the audience. I'm just going to use the last couple of minutes to pose those to you guys. So the first one I just wanted to pick up from someone anonymous. How do you find out the return on investment on controls? Who wants to take that one?
I'll make a stab at that, and these guys can correct me when I go wrong. I think it's twofold. Return on investment isn't just a pure cash-based discussion. I think, as I mentioned, something like a decent IAM solution pays for itself very, very quickly in terms of reducing the cost of user administration and just general help desk processes. So you've got that element, and you can do things like a business value assessment to actually work out what that cost is, because you know the cost in man hours of performing those tasks that are going to be automated. I think the other one is exactly what we're talking about here, which is if you can measure your risk, if you can apply that to your systems, and then you can say these controls reduce that risk by 60%, and the materiality of that risk is 100 million to this company, you've got a pretty good case to say that that's where you should be spending your money. But you need to tie it back to that risk-based discussion. And I think the ServiceNow piece talked about linking those risks to assets, and doing that sort of business impact analysis of those risks is key to securing the investment that you need from the board.
I think the key thing there, I think you said there, Tom, is being measurable. Different companies do it in different ways of being involved in trying to highlight how much things cost and what that return on investment is. For example, if you take an access review, so how long does an access review take? The system owners have to gather all the information that gets put into a spreadsheet methods and line managers. So all of this takes time. There's a cost associated with that time, etc. I've worked with other companies where they calculated it on the number of clicks, so they realised that doing an access review across the organisation, it took, I think it was like 5 million clicks per year they spent on this, and they were looking at reducing that down. So various different methods, but I think it's all about find something that's measurable, especially if you look at password resets. That's nice and easy to go through the service desk, and then therefore you can determine the return investment, at least for some parts, which helps you with a business case, especially for an IAM solution.
Thanks, guys. Cool. I'm going to wrap us up on time because we saw what happens if we don't at the beginning of this session. So thank you for everyone who was bearing with us at the beginning of the session. Thanks for sticking with us. There's a couple of questions there. 2 of them are or 3 of them are from anonymous people, but we answered one of them. But if you wouldn't mind dropping us an email, if you did submit your question anonymously around getting your security teams to talk with central risk teams, then we'll get Tom to respond to that. And Sini, I'll ask Chris to respond to you around your PAM question as well. So we'll make sure we get responses back to you. If you were anonymous, if you could drop us a line, then we'll be able to answer that question. Okay, thank you very much, guys. Great. It wasn't as vicious as Simon billed it in terms of a battle, but yeah, I think that's really good insight from you as a team, and thank you for doing that. Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.